Hey everybody, welcome back. Welcome to the very first video of my handmade home projects edition. I've done a couple of handmade home videos where I've shown you things I've made, usually sewing related items for my home. I've done quilts, I've done tea towels, I've done cushions and all kind of stuff, but I'm tackling a few projects in this space now that I'm moved and settled and have lived in it for long enough to really get a feel of what I care about, what I don't care about, what's worth redoing and adding and decorating and all of those things. So I also sometimes get questions from you in regards to my sewing, how I take an idea of what I want, make up something that didn't exist before, like loads of these things, especially if you are doing home sewing. They don't come with a pattern to make something, and then how to draft that, make it, and then come up with an end product, which hopefully we will find out together if it is what I had initially envisioned it to be. So by no means is this a tutorial. It is not a well-edited, concise, tried and tested, true version of whatever I'm making. This is quite literally me taking a thought, gee, this will be nice, trying to figure it out myself, taking some measurements, and just like working through the creative process, and we'll come up with something together at the end. So today's project, and the very first one I want to tackle, is my IKEA Kallax behind me here. I love my Kallax. It's great storage. It's open storage by design. You can get covers or inserts with, I guess, shelf inserts and then doors or baskets, but I did not want to go and buy more things to add to my Kallax. Instead, I thought it would make a whole lot of sense to create a curtain or some kind of a covering that goes from the second tier down to the floor. This is a 4-tier Kallax, so I will only have the top row visible, and I'll clean it up and put some nice looking things there, and everything below, my books, my stationery storage, the projector, sewing machine, all that stuff can be hidden underneath. Being this is a very large space, it's also a great place to show off some lovely fabrics, and I actually picked out a piece of fabric that was in my stash, and that is actually from IKEA. I make no promises about whether or not this is still in stock. If it is, I will link it for you. But I love the look that this is a polka dot with a organic touch. It's not super cookie cutter polka dot. It has some variation in these dots, if you will, a little bit Dalmatian. I hummed and hawed between a few fabric choices, but ended up deciding on this one. I am, however, also working with some restrictions that I set for myself because I had bought this fabric to use for dressmaking, and I don't want to cut it into itsy bitsy pieces. If I want to still use this fabric in the future, I want to leave it as large as possible. I also do want to make the curtain as functional as possible, so we might do some little loops. We might figure out what kind of open and close system works best, and with hopefully no damage to my actual Kallax shelves. So I hope that this will give you some inspiration, and if you're not, maybe this will inspire you to get a bit more creative. So let's go get our measuring supplies, get a sketchbook, and we'll make a draft of what's going to happen behind me. I always like to start my projects by holding up my fabric to the actual thing I'm working on. One, just to get a look of how the pattern will be, and interestingly in this case, I found out the Kallax shelves is about the width of both my arms extended and also almost exactly the width of this IKEA fabric. Now I wonder if that was intentional in the manufacturing of this fabric, since it also did come from IKEA. In this case, it wouldn't have made a big difference whether I used it lengthwise or widthwise. However, because I want to preserve as much of the whole piece as I can with the fewest number of cut lines and less work to stitch it up, I decided to use it widthwise from left to right and just cut the length of the fabric. It will all make sense later, but essentially it means one less line to snip and sew. Next, I do like to sketch out my thoughts and jot down the measurements on actual, pen to paper as well. Here I'm plotting out how many hooks I want to have, where it makes sense to put the hooks, and just to note the exact measurement of the area I'm going to cover with the curtain. Now, I prefer pen to paper versus digital also because we need to usually do a bit of math when you are calculating your own measurements for making stuff, and it's nice to see it on paper to see your work, so to speak, so that you know where you've made a mistake if things don't end up working out later on. But I will give you a zoom in to show you all the details that I thought about while I was sketching out the main idea for this curtain. Let's start off with a rough look at the size of the Kallax. Here is my drawing with 4 tiers. Here are the measurements for the 3 tiers on the bottom I want to cover. There's 2 ways to do this. I could make 2 curtain panels and split it down the middle, or I could make it one whole piece to minimize destroying the large piece of fabric. Now here are some detail points that I want to talk about. Number 1 is how I'm going to fold the hem. I'm going to do it extra wide for the bottom and for the top just by folding it under, nothing fancy. Next, I thought about the hoop loops I want to use to hold and hang the curtains with. I'm going to use some tool tape I probably pulled off of a recyclable bag or something like that. Notice the 2 lines that I drew right underneath the loop. That means there will be 2 stitching lines to hold it together for extra security. Thirdly, you see on the bottom is the bottom hem. I will also make a wide hem here to give it a bit of weight, but I also consider sewing something heavier, hence noted by the circles, to weigh down the bottom half so it doesn't swish around, especially if the fabric ends up being too light. I thought about adding little loops to the bottom as well so I can pull it up and hook it back to the top hooks if I want to access the bottom easier. We'll see how this works out. I started off with the easiest thing to do, which is to put on the command hooks. Now I love these hooks, they are great to use, and even though there's that little bit of that sticky foam tab thing that sticks out on the bottom, it doesn't really bother me because once I hang the curtain, it's really not noticeable. Here I'm trying to decide whether to put it above the middle bottom top ledge thing or under it. Apparently you can't put it directly on it because it actually sticks out a little and it's not perfectly smooth. In the end, I decided to place it right above the bottom divider piece, except that later on we will find out together that it doesn't quite work out, so I end up removing the placement of these and fixing them. But for now, in this clip, I seem really confident, so I stuck all 5 of them on and went about my next step. Okay, here's the little bit of math we have to do, but I promise it'll be painless. I know that the height of the area I want to cover on my Kallax is about 43 inches. That is the height. I want to add 3 inches to the top, inclusive of the part I'm going to fold in and fold under to be my top hem. I wanted the bottom hem to be just slightly wider, so I made it 4 inches. In total, 43 inches plus 7 inches means I need to cut my fabric to a length of 50 inches. Here's a tip. Use the kind of measuring tape that's often used for home renovations and stuff like that, the stiff metal kind. It's easier to lay out your fabric and just put your tape right over that instead of using the soft measuring tape. I just find it easier depending on what I'm working on, but definitely for something like this. I did not use the most precise method, but because of the nature of what I was working on, being a curtain, I wasn't too fussy about it. I marked a couple of dots with my washable fabric marker and then went over it with a straight edge to connect all the dots. It was easy then to just cut a strip of fabric at approximately 50 inches. Now to the ironing board. Here I'm ironing out the edge of my fabric just to make sure it's nice and smooth, and when I fold it in I can be exact about my measurements. I did not mention this, but it would seem common sense to iron your whole piece of fabric if it is particularly wrinkly and you want to get a clean measurement. It's of course hard to measure things correctly when your fabric is wrinkly. The main part of my fabric wasn't too bad, it was just the edges that were a little crumpled, so I didn't make a big fuss about it and just did the ironing step now. What I'm going to do, because the width of my fabric is almost exactly the width of the Kallax I'm going to cover, is that I will just simply fold in the left and right sides by a smidge, just about until where the writing is, and then stitch it down that way. You can just pin it down with some pins, or you can iron it under if you don't feel quite as confident just putting it through the sewing machine. All I did was one straight long stitch. Next, I worked on the top hem so I can attach the loops to hang. This little nifty tool I have is a seam gauge, but just a fancier version of the wimpy metal types that you may have used in your high school home economics class. I'll link it down below for you if you're interested. The first thing I did was to measure out my 3 inches total at the top and then iron that section to make a permanent, semi-permanent crease. So it's easy for me to know how wide it is and to make it consistent all the way across using my seam gauge. Then, with that being already folded, I folded the raw edge of that under by, like a ½ inch or so, just enough so I can stitch it under. That does not need to be super precise, it is just up to you. But I know that I took account of the 3 inches I left for the top hem. Now at this step, I also thought about the possibility of adding some stabilizing tape to the top hem because it will be pulled on by the hooks I will attach later. The best way to do this, I find, and the most inexpensive, if you do save ribbon, especially gross grain ribbon from packaging or presents or gift wrap or something, those are really great to use. The ones we can get nowadays are generally polyester, but that's fine. And it will give some strength and stability to that top area. I thought about it, hummed and hawed over it, and decided actually not to put it on. If your fabric is quite delicate or if it has a little bit of stretch, you may want to do that. I would just simply suggest that you sew a line straight across to hold it together just for extra strength. Otherwise, you could put some fusible interfacing along the top hem, but that just seemed like way too much work. Here you see me testing the stretch, and there really is none. And with the 2 layers of fabric, with the hem being folded over, in the end I decided it was not really necessary for this particular fabric. Now let's take a look at what I use for the loops for the curtain. I fished around in my scrap box and found some twill tape, which are, it's just black, kind of woven, I think it's cotton or a cotton polyester blend, doesn't really matter. It was a bit too wide, so I decided to fold it in half and stitch it down to make it just half of the width and just give it a little bit of just a little more beefiness as well. When you are making loops, it is important to think about how they twist. I prefer to do kind of a little house roof shape of a twist. So you twist it once, then you twist it down, and it makes a little triangle or a little point up top. That way your loops lay flat. Play around with a piece of ribbon, and I think you'll figure it out. Hard to explain. Now, without sewing the loops on permanently, I pinned it in the correct positions to match where the hooks were and tried it on. I hate trying things on as I am sewing garments, but since I did not have to mess up my hair by putting it on myself, I just hung it on and pinned it up and just see how it looked. This is where I found out one of the little issues with the leftmost and the rightmost, so the outer 2 loops, and then the way that things hung a little bit, I had to do some fixing there. The last thing to do is to even out and stitch down the bottom hem. Now if you remember, we left about 4 inches for the bottom. I could have just measured 4 inches from the other end, the raw hem side, but I decided to hang up the curtain, let it hang down naturally, and just put a pin where it grazes the bottom of the floor, and then folded that in. It was about 4 inches, which is what I had initially planned for. But again, when you're doing, on-the-go home sewing like this, you want to make some measurements, but also make adjustments as you go, and just don't, be too stiff in your thinking, and do whatever is easier and makes sense. As you sew more, a lot of these things will come to you intuitively. Alright, welcome back everybody. I'm now ready to show you the final finished design, and actually as you see it hung up right here, I've been using it for 2 to 3 weeks now since I first kind of put it together, with the thought that I want to actually use it and see if there are any further tweaks I want to make before showing you the final result and, let you know how it actually worked. Because oftentimes I find with these home projects that you're muddling about on your own, you are learning and changing and adapting things as you go, because an idea that works in your head may not actually work so well once you are using that item for whatever intended purpose. Now, let me just say though, this whole situation could be done way easier if you don't want to fuss about. A lot of the small details that I'm about to show you that I've added are kind of for my own just personal benefit and the way I see myself using this curtain, and just to make it look a little neater, if you will. So you can definitely take this and do it way easier, or if you like some of these elements I'm about to show you, feel free to add those in. Oh, our corner just got like real dark. I think the cloud just came out. Regardless, I'm going to insert cutaway clips as I talk you through some of the details I've added to this curtain situation. The first of which is placing my command hooks higher than the bottom of the first cubby. Initially, I thought it makes sense to hang my hooks just right flush with the bottom here. But what ends up happening, and I totally didn't think about this, is that there is a little bit of height with the loop. And if this was to hang lower, my loops would have to be lower, and you would actually see a little peep of the second cubby, which is not what I wanted. So I really had to hang the command hooks about maybe an inch, just about an inch above the bottom of the first cubby, which doesn't look the best, but I've kind of gotten used to it and it's fine. And I really wanted, it mattered more to me to have the bottoms covered than for these little command hooks to show, so I wasn't terribly bothered by it. Second detail I want to mention, this is, these are things that you realize as you work on a project, right? These 3 hooks here, the loops, which I've used just some leftover cotton tool tape that I've scavenged, work just fine, as they are. But the 2 loops on the side, so the first loop and the last loop, had to be placed a little bit more inwards so that when they are hung, they give some tension and pull on the curtain so that it lays a little flatter. When I had put them the same way that I had done the other ones, just straight up and down, it was real flappy on the side. It wasn't pulling a taut. So I moved it in a little so that when you hang it, you have to stretch them out just a smidge. And I think now it works wonderfully. So that's the second detail. Thirdly, I initially wanted to put some invisible loops on the bottom of the curtain so that if I want to reach for something on the bottom, or I was just doing something, I need the curtain up. Instead of taking the whole thing off and then doing whatever I need to do, I could use that loop to loop it up to the top here and hence kind of pull up the curtain without using my hands. Instead of doing that, I had figured out that it makes perfect sense to use a safety pin pinned to the back underside of the curtain, so that when I do need to lift something, I just take the safety pin, pop it onto a hook, and it's high enough to raise it so that I can access the bottom cubbies fairly easily without any problems. These are not, placed in like a real even manner. I just popped a few of the safety pins along the bottom, probably 3 or 4, and that's been really helpful. Now that I've used this setup for a couple of weeks, I've used that function, if you will, quite a number of times. Now here's a little tricky thing you may not have thought about. The nice thing about having loops and then having the command hooks is that if I wanted to or needed to access one portion of my shelf for an extended period of time, again, I can just take it here, take this loop, loop it to the other side, and then I can have, hands free, not have to hold the curtain, or even take the whole curtain off. Same if I wanted a bigger section, I can take both loops off and move it to the other side. Of course, it works the same the other way around. So I really enjoy this function, and overall, this curtain setup has worked so well for me. One little smidge which does bother me slightly, but not enough for me to go back and fix it, is the fact that I did not measure things exactly as I was going along. And I think sometimes, you know, when you're doing a house DIY, you just make it up as you go along, and that's perfectly fine, it's perfectly normal and perfectly okay. What I did notice is that on the left side, the length of the curtain hung just perfectly and just grazes the bottom of the floor. On the other side, what I noticed is that it hangs just like a couple millimeters longer, so it touches the floor versus grazing the floor. But these are little details that no one would notice except for me, because I made this. So those are kind of the details I really enjoy about my little curtain setup. I hope that you found this type of video a little bit informative, if you will, or maybe give you some ideas when you're working on something similar. If you're interested in seeing more of these types of videos, feel free to leave me a comment down below. Let me know your thoughts. Give this video a thumbs up so I know that you want to see more of them. And if you haven't subscribed, please do, so you don't miss out on any future videos, and hit that notification bell so that YouTube actually lets you know when things are going up. I can't wait to see you again next time. Take great care of yourselves, and I will see you soon. Bye, everybody.